Okay, so we are moving on with the class now. Now we are going to start talking about specific areas of policymaking and briefly examine how certain laws and policies are enacted and trying to trace the policy process through that. Now, before we get into that, however, I want to briefly, maybe not so briefly, revisit the uh, Poulantzas and Miliband debate. I talked about this a little bit in the first class, but I want to expand upon it a little bit more and maybe clear up some misconceptions that may have stemmed from the first article, largely based on my own unfamiliarity with some aspects of this debate. But since reading up on it a little bit more, I think I can provide a clearer explanation of the major points of this debate and how it can help us understand the policymaking process in what I would argue is a much more realistic way than the overly idealized policymaking process that we've been following through the textbook. Now, I talked about Jessup's strategic relational approach, which seeks to combine elements from both, and that is pretty much where we're going to end up um, again. Um, but I'd like to sort of go a little more in detail about this debate since it is a very important one. I'm relying on Clyde Barrow's book towards a critical theory of states, which helped illuminate many aspects of this. So, um, starting from the beginning, Poulantzas' uh, key book, Political Power and Social Classes, and Miliband's book, The State and Capitalist Society. You can see both published around the same time in the late 1960s. Both figures initially, praised each other, but then later fed into a debate between the two. Why should policy analysts care about state theory? Now, again, as I've been saying since the beginning of class, policy analysis often assumes a neutral, rational state that responds to problems and stakeholder input. The inputs going in uh, determine the outputs, the policies coming out. But the state is not neutral, of course, right? It is shaped by class interest, structural constraints, and global pressures. So understanding how the state actually works changes how you design, evaluate, and advocate for policy. Two competing views of the state in policy terms. Uh, Miliband's view, the state is an instrument that powerful economic interests use to get the policies they want. I would argue that Parenti's approach, who we've talked about in several classes, I think falls much more within the Miliband view of things. But again, as we'll see, and as Barrow argues, the debate between the two kind of condenses, and that you realize that both thinkers' views are not as antagonistic as it may first seem, and both of them seem to more or less end up in a similar place, which is that you have to understand both the structure that determines people's choices, that sets limits basically to what people can do. It's essentially an invisible structure, but one which exerts a powerful influence over us. But you also have to understand the sort of active interests of capitalists and workers, but mainly the capitalist class, who are much more organized and resourced, and their sort of active intervention in the policy process as well. Anyway, so the Miliband view, the state is an interest that powerful economic interests use to get the policies they want. The implication of this is watch who controls key agencies, follow the networks and appointments. Uh, the Poulantzas view, the state has its own structural logic that serves capitalism even when no capitalists are directly involved. The implication of this would be then that even progressive policies may be bent to serve capital accumulation over time. So the idea in the Poulantzas view is that the state has pretty much a permanent bias essentially towards capitalism, that it will serve capitalist interest even if there are no capitalists directly involved trying to push for this. Just because the limitations of how the state can act will produce outcomes that serve capitalist interests, even when they're not actively involved. The counterpoint to that, though, of course, and again, as Parenti and has shown, and others as well, is of course there's active intervention on the capitalists. So that kind of raises the question: if they don't need to intervene, why do they? If the state would simply just serve their interest anyway, then why do you see such aggressive attempts by capitalists to um, influence the policy of the state? Why the state disappeared from policy theory circa 1950s, 1960s. This is the height of the Cold War. It's kind of hard to ignore that as well. Mainstream policy theory, pluralism systems theory argued that power was dispersed among many groups. The state was seen as a neutral arena or a black box. Inputs, again, demands go in, outputs, policies come out. This could not explain the massive upheavals of the late 1960s, riots, Vietnam, worker rebellions, etc. A so-called post-behavioral revolution that brought the state back into focus, but as a contested terrain. So, I mean, you could get more into the Cold War politics of the era and how this influenced academia here in the United States. But, suffice to say, analysis of the state itself kind of disappeared from policy studies, which is kind of weird. You would think that the institution that makes the policies that you would want to understand how it works, but they simply seem to assume that it was just more of like a passive instrument that would just be influenced by whoever put the most demand upon it, basically. The policy relevance of the Miliband Poulantzas split. The debate was not just academic. It shapes how you answer core policy questions: who actually makes policy, elected officials, bureaucrats, capitalists, nobody. Why do some policy policy problems get addressed and others ignored? Can the state ever act against dominant economic interests? What is the role of policy analysis itself? Is it neutral expertise or legitimation of the existing order? Does it seek to make the status quo, the powers that be, seem like it is a legitimate, function or exercise of popular will, or meet some sort of standard of consent by the governed and things like that, or not? Is it just meant to appear that way? Legacy of the debate: fractured Marxist state theory into two warring schools. The instrumentalist school focused on social composition, networks, policy outcomes like social networks, basically. The structuralist school focused on structural constraints, functions, and reproduction. It seems honestly a bit silly to split up into two different schools like this, when it seems to me, at least, the fairly obvious answer, of course, is that, again, it's a little bit of both. Both have to sort of interact in some way. Apparently, though, it took people a long time to come to this view. This sort of parallels in some way a debate between what is referred to sometimes as structural Marxism and Marxist humanism, too. Marxist humanism focuses much more, on the idea of consciousness and people acting in a deliberate way. I won't go too much into it here, but it is an interesting debate. It's kind of like the Marxist theory version of the debate over free will. Do we actually have free will? Are we actually acting in our own sort of spontaneous way? Or if you take the sort of strong structuralist view, do we have no free will at all? Are basically all of our actions determined basically just by our position within the social structure? I mean, that is, Poulantzas seems to move away from that view. But that, at least according to Barrow, it is argued that those were the views of his mentor, another thinker named Louis Althusser. That you were saying, and I wonder if that's maybe somewhat of a simplification of his view to some extent, although based on a lot of what I've read about Althusser, maybe not, that you really don't have any free will. That all of your actions are basically determined by the structure that you sort of exist in. And that structure then can be broken down to sort of economic, political, and ideological levels. And for Althusser, it seems as if the idea is to understand how all three of these levels sort of interact and produce action. So when people are acting, they're simply sort of acting out um, what their position is within this structure, and particularly the interaction of these three different levels. It's an interesting view, to say the least. But again, most people seem to have come to the view now that, well, it's a little bit of both. Yes, the structure that we live in does, condition our actions in a very real way. It sets very real limits on what we can and cannot do. But within that structure, you still have some, relative ability to sort of act and decide on your own. Anyway, that's a bigger, more, sort of philosophical debate, but it is a sort of an interesting backdrop to this debate here. So again, this debate on Marxist state theory became an obligatory reference point for all subsequent theorizing on the modern capitalist state. Many later theorists tried to synthesize both insights, which is kind of where we'll end up. So Miliband's policy relevant theory, the state is a system of 5 institutional elements: the government, elected officials, the administration, the bureaucrats, basically, the coercive parts of the state, the military and police, the judicial element of the state, courts and prisons, and what he calls the subcentral, local and regional governments. Government is not the state, according to Miliband. You can win an election but still not control the bureaucracy, courts, or security forces. Capitalists reign but do not govern. They don't hold most offices, but they occupy key command posts, especially the regulatory and administrative agencies. So it's not a question that, capitalists literally make up the Congress, for example, although some of them do. I would also argue that many elected officials do essentially become capitalists, right? They accumulate wealth, they have investments, they have ownership. So they do sort of get brought into that capitalist class as well. But again, it's not so much that they have to dominate every single office, but that they dominate essentially the key offices, the key points at which policy is being made. Policy implication, policy change requires not just electoral victory, but also colonizing the deep state, the bureaucracy, and the central bank, etc. Miliband's structural constraints. So this is where Miliband's view sort of expands a little bit. He is not just this idea that, well, it's just capitalists just sort of acting and doesn't pay any attention to the sort of structure that they inhabit. He's not what they call a naive voluntarist, meaning that everything is just sort of happens in a voluntary way. Everything happens because people choose to act in a certain way. He does identify a structural mechanism. The state depends on private investment for growth, jobs, and tax revenue. Capitalists can threaten disinvestment or loss of confidence, and every government fears this. So there are sort of, or there is a pre-existing structure which constrains what the government can do. Even if the government isn't, or even if officials in the government aren't, sitting there, figuring out ways in which they can do the bidding of capitalists, capitalists do have a very strong leverage over the government as well, because they depend upon capitalism to maintain the economy, which then means to prevent economic crises, recessions, and depressions, and the kind of social upheaval that arises from that. So in that regard, it is a structural constraint, meaning it does not depend upon the free action or choice of a person. It is sort of more or less baked into the rules. It is more or less a permanent relationship that exists between the two. Policy implication, even without lobbying or campaign contributions, business has a veto power over many policies, for example, higher corporate taxes, strong labor protections, and environmental regulations, or at least can water these things down to the point where they don't really become too much of a threat. Poulantzas' policy relevant theory. The state's function, its role or its purpose, is to maintain cohesion of the social formation. to basically keep the whole system running. Three, ensembles regulated by the state: economic, organizing labor, enforcing contracts, property rights; ideological, schools, media, family, shaping what people think is possible; and then the political, the courts, and the bureaucracy. Policy is not just about solving problems; it is about reproducing the existing order, even when it appears to be re- reformist. So the function of the state within a capitalist system is to keep the system going, is to deal with problems that arise, and to resolve those problems in a way that you keep the whole system going, which of course is the profit driven nature of the capitalist system. There are disagreements between the two, of course, even when you account for the similarities in their views, which may not be apparent at first. Um, for Poulantzas, following Althusser, churches, schools, media, family are ideological state apparatuses. This is their terminology. They are part of the state's machinery of control. Miliband would say no. In liberal democracies, most of these are private. They're not directly controlled by the government. Conflating them with the state makes serious policy analysis impossible. So where do you draw the boundary between state and civil society? This affects how you analyze education, policy, media regulation, family policy, etc. Um, Barrow will later point out that Poulantzas seems to move further towards Miliband's view later on. And with this as well, the issue of state cohesion. The state has a rigorous internal unity derived from its objective function. Again, Miliband would say no. The state is often disaggregated, fissured, and contradictory. Different agencies pursue different goals. Miliband's view is more useful for policy analysis. It predicts bureaucratic politics, interagency conflict, and policy incoherence, which is what policy scholars actually observe. Again, Barrow would argue that Poulantzas came closer to this view later on. Why the debate matters for policy research design: if Poulantzas is right, focus on structural analysis of the mode of production, that's capitalism, but particularly what stage of capitalism that you're in. You can sort of break capitalism down into different stages as well. Functional requirements and how policy serves capital in the long run. If Miliband is right, focus on empirical institutional analysis. Who holds which positions? What networks connect state elites to business? What are the actual decision processes? Barrow's conclusion, and to me, again, I would say it seems fairly logical to think this way. Both are needed. Structural analysis tells you the limits. Empirical analysis tells you the actual policy dynamics. Now, Barrow also talks about C. Wright Mills as a policy theorist. Mills's The Power Elite was in 1956, one of the first empirical studies of how top decision makers in corporations, military, and state actually coordinate policy. The power elite shares social backgrounds, networks, and worldviews. It is not a conspiracy, but a structural convergence. You don't need secret meetings. Shared socialization and career paths produce policy consensus. Now, this is important also because Barrow will argue that most of Poulantzas's critique of Miliband actually applies much more to Mills than it does to Miliband. That Miliband had a more sophisticated analysis of the state. Now, this talk about conspiracy theories, of course, is interesting. What basically is he saying? So Mills is basically saying you don't need secret meetings and things like that. He writes here, as an elite, it is not organized, although its members often know one another, seem quite naturally to work together, and share many organizations in common. There is nothing conspiratorial about it, although its decisions are often publicly unknown and its mode of operation manipulative rather than explicit. A more sort of concise way of saying this comes from the writer Gore Vidal, who writes, the whole point to a ruling class is they don't conspire, the rulers. They all think alike, unless you get out of it as I did, and I defected. Gore Vidal sort of came out of this elite background. But I think this is an interesting phrase, right? There is no conspiracy among the ruling class. He's saying they all just think alike. They are educated more or less in the same way. They run in the same social circles. Of course, they are, defending a certain kind of class interest, even if they're not, fully aware of it. So that produces, circumstances which tend to lead to people to think the same way. So it doesn't require secret meetings. You could just sort of let people act in their own spontaneous way, and they will act in a way that seems almost conspiratorial, even though it isn't. And I tend to agree with that. The only thing I would add to it, and I've already talked about this in a previous class, is Parenti's idea of what he calls innocence theory. In other words, it's less realistic to assume that there's no coordination among the elites than to believe that, of course, there must be some level of coordination that goes on. To argue otherwise seems unrealistic, as he says. And I think that's true as well. So maybe, it's not full-blown conspiracies the way people often imagine it to be, or maybe they sort of lean too heavily on the idea of conspiracies to sort of compensate for their, lack of understanding of how policy is actually made and how power is actually exercised. Not all of it has to happen in secret, but certainly there must be at least some level of coordination that goes on. And again, to deny that there's any kind of coordination among economic elites at all seems very unrealistic to say, and doesn't seem to match up well when you actually consider the historical evidence. I would say, if anything, what we're learning about now with the Epstein files and all this other stuff seems that these conspiracies might have, much more of a reality to them than people had previously thought. But again, even then, I would still say, you can't just use conspiracy as your one size fits all explanation for everything. That it also has to be, combined with, I guess, a more, grounded, uh, an analysis of how policy is actually made, as well as also understanding this kind of structural analysis, this sort of interaction between economic, political, and ideological levels within society as well. So Mills was a critique. He went against Marxist theory in some aspects. He denied the idea of a ruling class and things like that. He preferred the term power elite. But there are various, critiques which came of this, which I think are, critiques that land pretty well. Mills lacked a theory of exploitation. He described higher immorality as a personal failing, not a structural feature of capitalism. Again, the implication of this is that without a theory of why the system produces bad outcomes, you end up with elite malfeasance explanations, bad people rather than structural explanations, incentives built into the system, in other words. And again, I think there's a powerful critique as well. It's not just bad people doing bad things. The system itself is designed in a way, or set up in a way, or exists in a way. Maybe people wouldn't like the idea that structure is designed, but that as it has sort of evolved over time, creates these outcomes. I often think of this in relation to somebody like Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, who her whole thing is, she's considered to be a left-wing progressive in the Congress, but her whole thing is basically, we just need to get rid of get rid of the bad capitalists and replace them with the good capitalists. That's her idea of what she thinks the problem with the system is, and that is just too shallow and superficial of an explanation. You need to go, a bit deeper than that. And by deeper, I mean, understanding the bigger picture, essentially. Critique number 2, Mills's own evidence showed what he called the political directorate is an appendage of the corporate rich, not autonomous. So again, be careful about assuming state autonomy, even when the evidence points to class domination. So in Mills's idea, Mills separates the power elite into the political, economic, and military realms, and shows that each aspect of this elite is, according to him, independent of each other, yet they sort of act in concert in many situations. However, according to Paul Sweezy, who was an influential Marxist economist, Mills's own evidence shows that the political aspect of the power elite isn't really independent at all. They're very much, tied to and dependent on the rich corporations and corporate actors, basically. So that contradicts Mills's own view that these things are independent from one another. That in fact that the corporate elites basically do more or less control the political aspect of the power elite. Mills will also talk about this idea of plain Marxism, which treats Marx as part of the classic sociological tradition. It's empirically grounded, historically specific. There is no party dogma. I think there's also an emphasis on plain language too, and speaking to people plainly. Whereas the structural Marxists are sort of infamous, you could say, for being very difficult to read, which is important. If you're actually trying to win over regular people, right? You don't want to go too far over people's heads either. It's a tough balance to make because these are complicated issues, so a certain level of complexity I think is called for. But you can obviously take it a little bit too far as well. This is the most useful orientation for policy analysis, according to Barrow. Treat power, class, and structural constraints as empirical questions, not a priori truths. In other words, not sort of like pre-existing truths, basically. So moving into this idea that Miliband was an instrumentalist and didn't understand, how the structure constrains political actors. Barrow shows, I think, quite convincingly that this is a straw man argument. This is not an accurate representation of Miliband's actual view. If anything, it applies much more to Mills than it does to Miliband, like I already said. Critics admit almost no actual policy analysis is purely instrumentalist. In other words, that the ruling class just gives orders and the state obeys. That's much, too simplistic of a view. Don't dismiss empirical policy research as naive instrumentalism. It is usually more sophisticated than the caricature. For criticisms of instrumentalism and Miliband's actual stance, again, that everything was just voluntary. Miliband actually focused on structural constraints. Again, capital's power to withhold investment is the most important one that he analyzes. The idea that Miliband doesn't understand ideology or how ideas tend to circulate, which the concept of ideology is a tricky one to pin down here. I'm just going to go with a fairly simple understanding of it. It's basically ideas used to essentially trick working class people into supporting capitalism. That essentially is kind of what it is when you boil it down to. Ideology can affect capitalists as well, but there's not that much of a need to, right? You don't need to convince capitalists to support capitalism. They're already benefiting from it, economically. You do have to convince working class people, though, however. So the charge, again, is that Miliband neglected this aspect, whereas Miliband actually devoted 2 chapters of his book to legitimation. To this idea that, it is important to essentially convince working class people that the system is a legitimate system that fairly represents their views, that there's not this, entrenched bias towards capital, which actually does exist. Miliband agreed with the idea of relative autonomy, which is probably Poulantzas' most important concept. He agreed that this is essential, that it's not just the case that the state automatically or so narrowly carries out the interest of the capitalist class. It's more that the state is there to not necessarily respond to the short-term interest of particular capitalists, but to make sure long-term that the capitalist system keeps functioning. And he cites Marx's phrase from the Communist Manifesto, referring to the state as a committee for managing common affairs. This idea of common affairs means that, again, pursuing the long-term interest of capital, not necessarily fulfilling every sort of short-term demand made by particular capitalists, or the most influential of the particular capitalists. And reform as well, it's often argued that because the capitalist class so thoroughly dominates the state, that reform is basically impossible. But Miliband, in contrast to this view, actually did acknowledge that reforms are possible, but only under mass pressure and within structural limits. Even then, there are limits to what can be accomplished through reform. So again, instrumentalism claims that reform denies that reform is possible. All reforms serve capital. Again, frankly, if you were to ask me, I tend to think that view is pretty much true for the most part. Miliband's actual position: reforms are possible when popular pressure is unusually strong. He cites Piven and Cloward here, two other sociologists. Or I think, no, I'm sorry, Barrow actually cites them. But they must stay within structural limits created by the economic system. Parliamentary reform alone is insufficient, requires mass movement on all fronts. Do not assume reform is impossible, but do not assume it can transcend the basic logic of capitalism without changing the balance of class forces. Poulantzas was not an abstractionist. This was Miliband's critique of him. He just uses this extremely dense language that nobody can, nobody outside of 15 people can probably understand. Barrow pushes back against this view as well. The structuralist label was a caricature from the debate. Poulantzas broke with Althusser early and persistently, especially on the state's economic role. Do not dismiss Poulantzas as a pure theorist with no interest in actual institutions. He wanted a regional theory of the capitalist state to inform empirical research. So he wanted to sort of, isolate and separate the capitalist state, from the other aspects of the structure, but come up with a general theory of how the state operates before going into, specific or particular state formation. So that would have been sort of like the next step. And there's indications, had he lived long, he also died very, very young at the age of 43 by taking his own life, unfortunately. But had he continued, he there's indications at least that he would have probably moved further into that direction. So one of Poulantzas' main contributions here, and where he really breaks with his teacher, Althusser, is emphasizing the economic role of the state. So for Althusser, the state is basically a question of repression plus ideology. The state exists to repress, to use force against the working class, and to essentially, again, brainwash them into supporting capitalism. That's essentially what the state does for Althusser. Obviously, that's a simplification. That's sort of a working definition that we can go off on. Prior to that, prior to Althusser, many Marxist theorists would have argued that the state was purely an instrument of repression and wouldn't even consider or give much emphasis to the ideological role of the state. The state simply existed as an instrument of repression. When the workers go on strike, you call in the government, they send in troops, and they put the workers down and force them to go back to work, basically. Althusser would add to that, well, it's that, but it's also the ideological aspect of the state matters as well. But again, Poulantzas would add to this, no, well, the state plays a very important economic function as well. The state has to make sure that the relations of production continue to exist. That is the relationship between employers and employee, between capitalists and the working class, right? These things don't just exist in nature. They are socially constructed, but once constructed, need to be continuously reconstructed or reproduced, as the terminology says. Many policies that appear non-economic, education, training programs, family policy, labor law, are actually about reproducing labor power and capitalist relations of production. Policy analysis must uncover these functions. Historical structuralism as a policy method. It is not an abstract structuralism that ignores history. In other words, you're not just looking at this in a purely abstract way, which is often the criticism made. Um, what you want instead is a theory of the capitalist state that is historically specific. The state's position vis-a-vis the economy changes with different stages of capitalism. In competitive capitalism, the state's economic functions were secondary. You could debate that, I think. But in monopoly capitalism, and after, a specialized state economic apparatus, central banks, finance ministries, development agencies emerged as dominant. Policy analysis must be periodized. What worked in the 1950s is not the same as what works in the 2000s. What policy analysts should keep from Miliband: empirical analysis of who occupies key state positions and how they are connected to economic elites, the concept of business confidence as a structural constraint, even without direct lobbying, an analysis of legitimation, how policy is sold to the public, and how legitimacy crises open space for reform, the reign but do not govern insight, distinguish between government elected officials and the permanent apparatus of the state, the so-called career bureaucrats, for example. What you should keep from Poulantzas, the state's functional role in reproducing capitalist relations of production. The state has relative autonomy. Again, it can act against short-term capitalist interests to serve the long-term class interests, to serve the long-term interests of capitalism, to make sure that the system itself keeps functioning. He later came up with this term authoritarian statism, which I think is interesting. Seems to suggest a lot of where governments have actually headed since the 1970s. A diagnostic tool for understanding contemporary trends. I'll talk about this more in the next slide. The concept of state form. The state's structure changes across historical periods, as I've already said. What is this idea of authoritarian statism, though? I think it's an interesting term. A new state form emerging in the 1970s and 80s, accelerating after increasing state intervention in the economy. Economic planning becomes machinery for deeper social control. Legitimation shifts from schools and universities to media. New technologies of surveillance. The state becomes an isolated, impregnable fortress, accessible only to internationalized capital. There's a decline of political parties, or maybe you could argue that the choices between political parties become increasingly meaningless. You have no real alternative between the political parties. You have a rise of a repressive apparatus, police, courts, private security, contractors. In other words, basically all things that have actually come to be, right? I mean, what he's talking about here in the late 1970s, basically has happened. The false dichotomy dissolves in policy analysis. When you're actually analyzing a specific policy process, for example, healthcare reform, financial regulation, or trade policy, you need both. Structural analysis: what are the limits set by the mode of production? What are the functional requirements of capital accumulation? In other words, what is necessary to allow for capital to accumulate, which means the exchange of commodities and profit generated from that. Institutional empirical analysis: who is in charge, what are their interests, what networks connect them, what are the decision processes. Do not choose sides in the debate, use both toolkits. However, this debate continues to go on, or at least it did for a long period of time. After the Poulantzas Miliband debate, Marxist state theory was stuck. People kept arguing over structure versus agency, empiricism versus concept, production, instrumentalism versus structuralism. Barrow argues this stalemate persists because we confuse two different levels of analysis: state form and theory of the state. They are not the same thing. One is a tool, the other is the work you do with that tool. So what is the state form? This comes out of Poulantzas. It is an abstract formal object, meaning a state form is a general abstract model of how the state is organized and functions in a particular stage of capitalism. It describes what the state's principal functions are, how its internal apparatuses are structured and which one is dominant, how it reproduces capitalist relations of production as a system. Examples of state forms. You have the liberal state form, characteristic of 19th century competitive capitalism, minimal economic intervention, repressive and ideological apparatuses dominant, state as night watchman. In other words, the state takes a reduced role. It's a reactive role, basically, like a night watchman, basically someone that's patrolling the streets at night, making sure, watching out for problems, basically. This gives way to the monopoly capitalist state form, which is characterized by a welfare state. We haven't talked about Keynesian economics, but basically that was the economic theorist that more or less devised the rationale for more government intervention in the economy to stimulate consumer demand through various spending policies and things like that. But basically, what we refer to today as the welfare state. Economic apparatus emerges as important. State actively manages aggregate demand, combined demand in the economy. And again, Poulantzas would argue this is in turn giving way to what he calls authoritarian statism. We covered increasing state intervention in the economy combined with declining representative democracy, rise of surveillance and executive power, legitimation shifts from schools to media. What state form analysis does well identifies a crisis that precipitates a transition from one form to another, explains how the new form functions to stabilize capitalism. For example, how neoliberal state form restores profitability after the crisis of the 1970s, provides a periodization, a way to say we are no longer in the welfare state era, we are in a different state form. What state form analysis does not do, it does not tell you how the state actually works in this specific country at this specific time on this specific policy issue. It is an abstract formal object. It is a model, not a description of reality. Form analysis is not a theory. It is a starting point, not an ending point. So you need to build on that. A theory of the state, analysis at the level of particular social formations. A genuine theory of the state must operate at the level of particular social formations, concrete, historically specific societies, the United States, Greece, or Mexico, for example, subnational regions, Catalonia or Quebec, or international regions, the EU or NAFTA. A theory of the state asks questions like, how does the national state actually make policy in healthcare, finance, trade, or labor? How do structural mechanisms, for example, business confidence, public debt, investment strikes, operate differently in the US versus Greece versus Mexico? How do institutional arrangements, federalism, parliamentary versus presidential systems, central bank independence mediate class power? In other words, how does it interact with class power or sort of shape the dynamics of class power? How do historical legacies, strong labor movements, clientelism, colonial past, help shape what the state can and cannot do? The same abstract state form will play out very differently in different countries. The U.S. has a massive federal bureaucracy, a powerful central bank, and a two-party system. Greece, for example, has a weaker state, is subject to European Union, IMF conditionality, and has a history of popular mobilization. A theory of the state must account for these differences. Barrow's most important claim moving forward at this level of particular social formations, the methodological, epistemological disputes between Poulantzas and Miliband recede into the background. In other words, the differences between how they analyze the state and what they consider to be valid knowledge of the state isn't as important anymore. Why? Because when you're actually trying to explain why a specific policy succeeded or failed in a specific country, you cannot afford to be a pure structuralist or a pure instrumentalist. You need both. Structural concepts from Poulantzas, relative autonomy, state as a condensation of class forces, ideological apparatuses, authoritarian statism. These are some of the key concepts that he uses. Empirical institutional analysis. Who holds power? What are their social origins? What networks connect state elites to business? How do bureaucratic politics shape outcomes? So again, you need both. Example from the text, US versus Greece. Public debt. After this, we'll then move into talking about healthcare. But just to flesh it out a little bit more, public debt as a constraint on state policy in both the U.S. and Greece. High public debt limits the state's ability to spend on social programs. But how this works is completely different. In the U.S., the Federal Reserve can print money. The U.S. borrows in its own currency. Debt ceilings are political theater. How much the debt level can be raised. The state retains enormous fiscal space despite high nominal debt. In Greece, however, Greece borrows in euros, a currency it does not control. It is subject to conditions from sort of external political actors. Debt is an external discipline imposed by other states and financial markets. You cannot understand the policy dynamics of debt using only Poulantzas' abstract concept of state form. You need the empirical work the Miliband provides, a detailed study of institutional arrangements, historical legacies, and actual decision-making processes. So putting it all together, a two-step process for policy analysis. Now, again, this comes very similar to Jessup's approach, who we've already talked about, who Barrow also cites. But I'm just trying to flesh it out a little bit more. Identify the state form. What stage of capitalism are we in? What is the dominant apparatus? What is the crisis that triggered the transition to this form? Since the 1970s, we have shifted from the welfare state form to a neoliberal form, characterized by the dominance of the state economic apparatus, central banks, finance ministries, the Treasury Department, which is basically our equivalent of a Ministry of Finance, the hollowing out of the state, and authoritarian statism. Step 2, develop a theory of the state for a particular social formation. How does this global state form, in other words, a state form that is more or less shared across most of the world, get mediated by national institutions, history, and class struggle? In other words, how does this state form sort of interact with the distinct histories and institutional frameworks of particular states? Who actually occupies the command post of the state economic apparatus in this country? What networks connect them to domestic and international capital? How do structural constraints, business confidence, debt, investment strikes operate given the country's specific institutional arrangements? Again, the neoliberal state form takes one shape in the U.S. with its Federal Reserve, dollar hegemony, and weak labor movement, and another shape in Greece with its constraints but also a stronger history of left-wing mobilization as well. Neoliberalism, if I haven't already said it, is basically a move away from this idea of a welfare state. It's not a retreat of the state, as people often confuse it to be or mischaracterize it as. The coercive aspects of the state actually remain quite strong, and it's really in the capacity of the welfare function of the state, providing economic assistance to working class and poor populations. That tends to recede away, but the coercive aspects of the state stay in place. It is a more aggressive attempt to favor business interests, and is very much a strong component of the globalization of the world that you've seen, particularly since the 1990s. But again, as Barrow and others have pointed out, globalization would not be possible without the state sort of authorizing it, signing treaties, signing agreements to allow for this to to happen. And again, in very important ways, still retain strong authority as well. This is just a table to summarize what I already said. I don't think I have to repeat it again here. Okay, now let's get into how we could apply this analysis to something like the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Now, the public policy textbook, as you know, every chapter focus on a different aspect of the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Unfortunately, I would argue its analysis of it was quite insufficient and never really captured the real dynamics which shape the origins of this law and the consequences of this law then on everybody else. So if we apply this approach, which again is very similar to Jessup's approach as well, identify the state form. So the current state form, a neoliberal financialized capitalism with emerging features of authoritarian statism, surveillance, executive power, decline of representative democracy, but not fully developed. You could argue it's become more of authoritarian statist form since then. Financialized capitalism just refers to the fact that more and more of the economy relies upon financial services as a dominant form of economic activity in the United States. Financial speculation. I mean, we're just talking about this, in the aftermath of Elon Musk becoming the world's first trillionaire and things like that. Something which could only be possible under this financialized system of capitalism that we have. Which still depends upon exploiting workers. Also, there's a whole debate about that as well. I don't want to get too off track here. The dominant apparatus, the state economic apparatus, the Treasury Department, the Fed or the Federal Reserve, HHS, Health and Human Services, another cabinet office, along with the Treasury Department. The Federal Reserve is a little bit different. Now a major economic actor via insurance markets, subsidies, and mandates. Also, the ideological apparatus, media, think tanks heavily involved in legitimation struggles. In other words, selling a particular view of healthcare to the public. What was the crisis trigger for the ACA? Not an economic crisis, but a legitimation crisis. 45 million, roughly, uninsured, rising premiums, medical bankruptcies, and a long-standing failure of the private insurance market to cover everyone. The crisis threatened the legitimacy of the entire capitalist system by exposing its ability to provide a basic social good, healthcare. Functional requirements of this state form. The state must stabilize the private insurance market and reduce the legitimation threat. So now we're saying what role the state plays in stabilizing capitalism, basically, and reduce the legitimation threat without, of course. So these are the limits placed upon it. It can't disrupt the profitability of the insurance, pharmaceutical, and hospital industries. That would be too much of a disruption to the functioning of capitalism. Creating a genuinely public system that, again, would threaten capital accumulation in healthcare or trigger a business confidence crisis, investment strike by healthcare sectors. So the idea here is that this would be a limitation, even if all the capitalists stayed home and were, playing polo or, whatever it is they do in their free time, even if they weren't sort of, aggressively lobbying the government or exerting pressure on the government in various ways, that these things alone would, severely limit what you could do with healthcare reform in the United States. However, again, this doesn't acknowledge the actual historical record, which of course there were extremely aggressive efforts by pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies to limit what could be made with this law. Prediction from state form analysis alone, the policy outcome will be a market-based, subsidy-driven, mandate-enforced system that preserves private insurance as the core, expands coverage through regulated markets, and avoids any direct state provision. The state will act as a regulator and subsidizer, not a provider, which is basically exactly what you got. So again, I mean, using this analysis of the state, just by analyzing the form of the state and its role within the capitalist system, you can already pretty much determine how the Affordable Care Act would have actually turned out. But you can do more. So who occupied command posts in the state apparatus? So of course you have the president, Barack Obama, a centrist Democrat, not a single payer advocate. His 2008 campaign included a public option, but not single payer. Key executive branch officials, Kathleen Sebelius, HHS secretary, former insurance commissioner from Kansas, friendly to industry. Peter Orszag, the OMB director, very pro-market as well. Lawrence Summers, and his chief economic advisor, former Treasury Secretary, very much Wall Street aligned. So already when you're looking at the key personnel, just within the executive branch, they're all people who are very close to the industry and very much, pro business, basically. Obama's chief advisor, Rahm Emanuel, famously said, single payer will never happen. That's not the plan. Well, there you go. Now we turn to key congressional leaders. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, both faced a narrow majority. 60 votes needed in the Senate to overcome filibuster after Al Franken was seated in July 2009, then lost to 59 seats after Ted Kennedy's death in August 2009. Besides the congressional leaders, you have key committee chairs within the Congress that, like I already said in a previous class, shaped the legislation. You had Max Baucus, Senate Finance Committee, a moderate Democrat from Montana, heavily influenced by the insurance industry. But Baucus held 17 private meetings with industry lobbyists during drafting. Private meetings. So, you don't know what was going on within these meetings. His Baucus bill in October 2009 omitted a public option. So single payer off the table, public option now off the table as well. Class interest and fractions involved. The insurance industry, private insurers wanted an individual mandate to bring in healthy customers and subsidies to make coverage affordable, but opposed a public option, a government-run plan that would compete with them. Also wanted limits on regulation of premium increases. The pharmaceutical industry wanted no price controls, no Medicare drug price negotiation, made a deal with the White House, $80 billion in concessions over 10 years, closing the donut hole fees in exchange for no price controls. The hospital industry wanted coverage expansion to reduce uncompensated care and agreed to over $150 billion in Medicare payment reductions over 10 years. Labor unions wanted a public option for single health care, but were willing to accept the ACA as an incremental improvement, very incremental. As I've said, prior to this, there's basically been no, improvement to it since then, other than the COVID, expansions of additional subsidies and things like that. But all those things have basically gone away now. Unions were strong supporters, but not decisive. So, and since we're talking about this in hindsight, we can already say that basically all the major business interests here, the insurance industries, the pharmaceutical industries, the hospital industries, pretty much all got what they wanted. Unions basically did not. Small businesses wanted no employer mandate. In other words, no mandate that they would be forced to provide healthcare to their employees rather. Eventually, exempted firms with less than 50 employees were not mandated to provide insurance. So if a company that employed more than 50 people did have to, a company that employed less than 50 does not have to. Class fractions within capital. So not all capitalists are, of course, necessarily on the same page with each other. Private insurers got the mandate and subsidies. Pharma got no price controls. Hospitals got more paying patients. Losers, single payer advocates, no public option, no price control on drugs. Public option would have threatened insurance industry profitability and triggered massive lobbying opposition. It was dropped to secure industry support. So in other words, they didn't even try to challenge the industry here, the insurance industry, for example, and the others. They just said, "Well, look, we're not going to win this, so we'll just get rid of the public." They didn't even really fight for a public option. In other words, additional institutional constraints shaping the policy to get the 60 votes. You need to get Joe Lieberman, an independent from Connecticut, heavily funded by insurance industry, threatened to filibuster any bill with a public option. The public option was removed in December 2009 to secure his vote. Nice of him to do that. After passage, the Supreme Court made Medicaid expansion optional for states. This was a concession to conservative state governments, not a feature of the original design. As a result, 10 states have not expanded Medicaid, leaving a coverage gap. Budget reconciliation rules. After Scott Brown won Ted Kennedy's seat, a Republican taking over the a Democratic seat, or the seat of Ted Kennedy, who was a Democrat. Democrats passed final amendments via reconciliation, which does not require 60 votes, but only 51 votes, which limited what could be changed, but did not alter the core structure. Structural mechanisms, business confidence, threat of capital strike. The insurance industry spent $380 million on lobbying in 2009 and 2010, more than any other sector. They did not threaten disinvestment. They threatened political opposition in public campaigns. The Obama administration understood that passing a bill with a public option would trigger a full-scale industry war, possibly killing the bill entirely. But I would argue, in contrast to that, the unwillingness to really fight for this thing was, I think, a important strategic failure of the Obama administration. They're referencing here, the Clintons' attempt to pass a healthcare reform bill in the 1990s, which failed. I think you could also argue that the situation, the economic situation for many people had gotten so much worse since the 1990s that, would the insurance industry have been able to essentially brainwash the American public into going against healthcare reform? We can't really say for certain one way or the other. I would argue, again, that there are important factors that have to be considered. You can't just compare it to the 1990s. The economic situation for people had changed a lot. And like I said, they didn't even really try to fight for it. So they pretty much gave it up without much of a fight, or with a threat, but not actually, engaging in a fight over it. The administration internalized the need to keep industry at the table. Rahm Emanuel reportedly told progressive advocates the public option is dead because the insurance industry will not support it, and we cannot win without them. Well, that sounds like a very definitive statement, but how does he know that we cannot win without them? I mean, he seems to be assuming again that although engage in this PR campaign and they'll basically kill the bill that way. To me, it just seems a little too convenient to say that, again, and basically Emmanuel is just pretending pretending he's essentially being forced into doing something that he's not really being forced into doing. He's very much on the side of these insurance companies anyway. So policy outcome, the Affordable Care Act, key provisions, some of which we've already covered already. But since it's complicated, maybe it's worth going over again, or since there's a lot to keep in mind. An individual mandate, a tax penalty for not having insurance, later upheld by Supreme Court as a tax. Employer mandate, large firms with more than 50 employees must offer coverage or pay a penalty. State-based insurance exchanges, marketplaces where private insurers sell plans, subsidies, tax credits for low and middle income individuals to buy coverage, Medicaid expansion to 138% of federal poverty level, later made optional by Supreme Court. The Medicaid expansion, not 138% of the federal poverty level, which I'll return to that in a moment. I mean, it's very, very low. Who can actually qualify for Medicaid? It's a very low threshold that has to be met. And so what happens is that many people who probably could benefit significantly from the coverage are essentially priced out of it because of their income level, even if they still basically have a relatively small income. Um, Regulations guaranteed issue cannot deny for pre-existing conditions. Community rating, limited variation by age and health, essential health benefits. These are basically things to prevent insurance companies from selling people a policy and putting some kind of limits upon the premiums. But again, as we'll see, it did not really do all that much. No public option, no single payer, no price controls on drugs except modest Medicare changes, no cap on premium increases, only rate or review. What the state form alone explains, why the ACA is market based, why there is an individual mandate, why the bill was incremental, why the insurance and pharmaceutical industries made concessions, very limited ones, but retain core profitability. The state must reproduce the conditions for their accumulation. Um, Miliband's analysis would add why there's no public option because of specific actors: Joe Lieberman's filibuster threat, Max Baucus's industry-friendly drafting, Rahm Emanuel's strategic decision to drop to keep industry support. Now here's an interesting question that you can ask to kind of push back against this a little bit. And also, the analysis would suggest that these people played a very key, decisive role in it. And had it not been for their intervention, things may have played out differently. Now, a stronger structuralist explanation would argue, well, it doesn't really matter. If these people weren't there, somebody else, would have basically performed the same role. And that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that that's entirely wrong either. So, the key question here is, did the specific intervention on these people, was it so crucial in shaping the outcome, or was it almost like a foregone conclusion? And if not them, somebody else would have basically played the exact same role. It's an interesting question to consider. I don't necessarily know if I have the answer for it, but it is an important thing to keep in mind. I guess my instincts tell me that maybe I sort of lean a little bit more towards that idea that if it wasn't them, somebody else would have played the role. But then again, you have to allow for some level of contingency as well. If you say, well, it doesn't matter, somebody else would have played the same role, then you are basically saying, well, things would have played out exactly the same way, that we're sort of stuck on this rigid path, and there's very little that you can do to change it. That was, by the way, I think I glossed over it uh, before, but one of the areas where Poulantzas breaks with his teacher, Althusser, is over this idea that Althusser doesn't seem to allow for any um, sort of place for the class struggle to play itself out. For Althusser, when conflicts arise in capitalism, when there's resistance on the part of people, it stems from breakdowns within the system. That we're almost like robots, or just sort of acting out what our environment sort of tells us to do, what's the social structure around us sort of tells us to do. And when there is resistance to capitalism, it sort of stems from a breakdown in the system, and the breakdown happens, and then people just sort of more or less mechanically respond to the way people would respond, you would argue, to this kind of breakdown. Poulantzas would seem to later on move away from the view a little bit and say, well, no, you have to allow for some agency in class struggle as well. So that's kind of the point I'm getting at here. If you always just say, like, well, it doesn't matter who was there, somebody else would have played the same role, then you do kind of fall back into this idea that everything is more or less determined anyway. So I don't, like I said, I don't have that much of an answer to it, and probably should have just stuck with that instead of this long tangent. Why Medicaid expansion became optional: because of a specific institutional actor, the Supreme Court, not a functional requirement of capitalism. The court's decision was contingent 5-4 and shaped by conservative legal ideology, not by capital accumulation logic. As a result, millions remain uncovered in non-expansion states. Why did the bill pass in 2010 specifically? Because of a particular political conjuncture. Large Democratic majorities, president who prioritized healthcare, although not single-payer healthcare, and a sense that the window would close after the midterms, which it did, of course. Why were labor unions disappointed but not opposed? Well, frankly, you could argue that labor unions are too much, co-opted and sort of, brought into the establishment, don't really play the role which they should play, which is to be more of an oppositional role. But because of their specific relationship to the Democratic Party and their calculation, this was the best possible given constraints, historical institutional fact, not a structural requirement. Well, I think that analysis lets the labor unions off the hook a little bit too much. They certainly should have resisted more, but they didn't. And that giving in or capitulation, I think, is due to the fact that they are too close to the Democratic Party. And frankly, if you go with what radical critics say of labor unions in the United States, that they are essentially an extension of corporate management anyway. They're not really there to represent workers. They're essentially there to police and control workers. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Kind of goes outside the scope of this class. Why did some states implement robust exchanges while others sabotage them because of partisan control of state governments? Again, a contingent political factor, not a functional requirement of the state form. So it's sort of saying that these things could have gone either way. Whether or not the states set up better insurance exchanges wasn't really going to change the underlying profitability conditions that much anyway. So that's more of the particularity of who was actually in control of the states and stuff. Now we'll turn to the Kaiser Family Foundation little primer on the Affordable Care Act. Provides a lot of information I've already covered, but it does go a little more into detail. So prior to the ACA, gaps in the public insurance system, a lack of affordable private coverage left millions without health insurance. The number of uninsured Americans grew over time, especially during economic downturns. By 2013, the year before the ACA's major coverage provisions took effect, more than 44 million non-elderly individuals lacked coverage. The ACA changed coverage options and availability. ACA coverage provisions as of 2014, Medicaid expansion, expanded Medicaid to cover nearly all adults with incomes at or below 138% of the federal poverty level, but only in states that adopted the expansion. Now, again, let's keep in mind, 138% of the federal poverty level. For 2018, it's an individual making only $16,000 a year. I mean, that's absurdly low. So not that you shouldn't cover people at that level, but what it means, of course, is that any individual person making above that, which would still be extremely low. I mean, you could double that amount, and that's still an extremely low income, would not be eligible. So you can't get Medicaid. So that is, of course, one of the major problems of the ACA. I mean, at face value, some of these ideas might seem like good ideas, to expand Medicaid, for example. But when you get into the details of it, it's designed at such a low level that, it effectively excludes millions of people who, could otherwise benefit from this coverage. Marketplace tax credits made tax credits available for people with incomes up to 400% of the federal poverty level who purchase coverage through a health insurance marketplace. 2008 income example. So again, that only goes up to about $50,000 per year. Allows you to buy a tax credit to, make the insurance premium a little more affordable. But, again, even that's very, very, very low level. Initial results, millions enrolled in ACA coverage. The uninsured rate dropped to a historic low by 2016. Coverage gains were particularly large among low-income adults in states that expanded Medicaid. So again, there's a lot of people at this very low income level. But again, there's also the problem, the fact that there's millions of other people that would fall outside of that. Changes to the ACA and the Trump administration, failed attempts to repeal and replace the ACA, despite Despite failed repeal, several changes to ACA implementation occurred that affected coverage, which of course led to a rise in the uninsured rate. The first time since it was implemented in 2017, the number of uninsured rose to almost 30 million people. Who remains uninsured and why? Highest risk groups, low income individuals, adults, people of color. Primary barrier to coverage, cost of coverage continues to be the most commonly cited barrier. Why some remain uninsured under current law. Nearly half of the remaining uninsured are outside the reach of the ACA for one of the three reasons. So, in other words, of the almost 30 million people that are uninsured, it's because they don't qualify um, based on the very low thresholds that the ACA makes for who can qualify under Medicaid or who can even qualify for a credit. Their state did not expand Medicaid. They are subject to immigrant eligibility restrictions. Their income makes them ineligible for financial assistance. Remainder are eligible for assistance but may still struggle with affordability, knowledge of their coverage options. How lack of insurance affects access to care, delayed or foregone care. Uninsured people are far more likely than those with insurance to postpone health care or forego it altogether. Severe consequences. Consequences can be severe, especially when preventable conditions or chronic diseases go undetected. The safety net is insufficient. Public hospitals, community clinics, health centers, and local providers provide a crucial source of care, but do not close the access gap for the uninsured. Financial implications of lacking insurance. Trade-offs with essentials. Uninsured people often weigh health insurance and medical care costs against equally essential needs like housing, food, and transportation to work. So you have to choose between one or the other, which is very cruel and inhuman thing to subject people to. Financial stress. Many uninsured adults report financial stress beyond just healthcare. Full cost of care. When uninsured people use healthcare, they may be charged the full cost of that care versus insurers who negotiate discounts. Difficulty paying bills. Uninsured individuals often face difficulty paying medical bills. Providers absorb some of the cost of care for the uninsured. While these funds cover some costs, they do not fully offset the cost of care for the uninsured. ACA's achievements. Historic drops in uninsured rate, millions gained insurance, access, and protection from catastrophic costs. Remaining gaps, system still leaves millions uninsured. Again, as we've already said, 45% of remaining are uninsured are not eligible for coverage under the ACA. 55% of eligible for assistance, but struggle with affordability, knowledge, and need targeted area. So even people who could find some kind of coverage under the Affordable Care Act still find the cost to be unaffordable. Consequences of being uninsured, ongoing policy threats, altering ACA, restricting Medicaid could cause further coverage losses, access barriers, financial strain. Well, of course, this is happening as well under Trump's budget, kicking millions of people off of Medicaid as well. Overall spending. This is not from the document I uploaded, but I did a little additional research here. Total national health expenditures reached 5.3 trillion in 2024, 7.2 increase from 2023. Per capita spending was over 15,000 in 2024. To put this in perspective, per capita spending was $353 in 1970, or about $2,000 in constant 2024. So, essentially adjusted for inflation. So people are spending way more on healthcare. And of course, spend way more on healthcare than every other country. As a share of GDP, healthcare spending accounted for 18% of the economy in 2024. This is up slightly from 17% in 2010. Actually, it's a pretty big increase, I would say. Premium increases. Premium growth has differed significantly between employer-sponsored plans and the individual ACA marketplace. Employer-sponsored insurance from 2010 to 2024, average family premiums for employer-based plans grew by 68%. Pretty massive. Through the ACA marketplace, premiums grew by 129%. So, again, the idea of like making healthcare affordable, keeping these premium costs from ballooning massively, it's just been a complete failure. Um, we'll see at the end that some people argue, well, it did slow down the rate of increase of healthcare costs. I mean, even if that's true, it's still at a level that is just unacceptable for most people. It's still just too expensive for most people. And again, we're talking about something that's treated as a commodity anyway, when there's a very good argument to make that healthcare should not be treated as a commodity. In other words, something that is basically sold in order to make a profit. It is important to note that premiums in the individual marketplace were already rising before the ACA, growing by at least 10% a year from 2008 to 2010. Out of pocket costs, particularly deductibles, have also seen substantial increases. The average deductible for ACA marketplace plans experienced its steepest increase in history in 2026, rising by 37% to a record high of almost $4,000. KFF described this as the steepest increase in deductibles ever seen in this market. For ACA bronze plans, the average deductible is projected to reach roughly $10,000 in 2026, nearly double what it was a, a, a decade ago. So, for anyone who knows how this works, or doesn't know how this works, I should say, that's basically what you have to spend on healthcare before your insurance even kicks in. So if you're on an ACA bronze plan, you basically have to pay $10,000 out of pocket before your insurance will even start to cover you. Has ACA bent the cost curve? While costs have risen in absolute terms, there is evidence that the ACA helped slow the rate of growth compared to pre-2010 projections. Slower than forecast in 2010, government actuaries projected that healthcare spending would reach 21.2% of GDP by 2024. The actual figure was 18%, a difference of over 3 percentage points, representing nearly 1 trillion in savings relative to those expectations. Historically slow growth, a 2026 Brookings Institution, very mainstream, think tank, analysis concluded that the period from 2010 to 2024 saw the slowest growth of medical spending relative to GDP since 1960. The author stated that the United States has bent the healthcare cost curve. So, they're trying to give a good face to it, give a optimistic projection of this. I would argue that, again, when you break it down into dollars and cents and what the average person is, actually paying for healthcare, it's just not an affordable system, certainly. And really, you wonder how sustainable this is in the long term when people are under, increasing financial stress. And of course, that financial stress also leads to people turning to certain types of political leaders who make empty promises to, do something about it. But of course, if they ever get into power, don't do anything. Just like Trump promised he was not going to cut anyone on Medicaid, and of course he made massive cuts to it. I don't have the slide here, but I would also, if I would add to this even more, you should look at the data of actual medical bankruptcies, or bankruptcies because of medical debt in the United States. It's incredibly high and increasingly getting high as well. So, again, I want to, give the devil his due and all that, and try to look at things in a balanced way. But I think on balance, when you take everything into consideration, I don't think you could really argue that the ACA is any spectacular success. It's oftentimes, what you get with the Democratic Party is they're trying to basically put, like a Band-Aid on like a bullet wound, basically. They're coming up with, very minor solutions for very serious problems. And of course the solutions are not up to the size of the challenges that they are facing. So that's, again, one way of looking at it. And so that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap this up here. Okay, so take care, everyone.